Right now, the global financial system is sitting on $348 trillion in debt. Not billion, trillion. A number so large that if you tried to count it out loud, $1 per second, it would take you 11 million years. And every single government on Earth knows this is unsustainable. Every central bank knows. Every finance minister knows. But nobody is stopping. In fact, they're accelerating. Global borrowing hit a record $27 trillion in 2025 alone, and it's projected to climb to $29 trillion in 2026. We have never been here before, or so we're told, but we have. We've been here before, almost exactly, 100 years ago, and the people living through it then had no idea what was coming, until it was already too late. This is the story of the Weimar Republic, and more importantly, this is the story of what's happening right now. To understand Weimar, you need to understand how Germany got there. Because it didn't happen overnight. It never does. The seeds were planted years before anyone saw the explosion coming. Germany lost World War I in 1918. The victorious Allied powers gathered in Paris and wrote the Treaty of Versailles, one of the most punishing peace agreements in modern history. Germany was declared solely responsible for the war and ordered to pay reparations equivalent to roughly $33 billion in 1921 dollars, an almost incomprehensible figure for a country whose economy had already been gutted by 4 years of industrial warfare. To put that in perspective, Germany was still making reparation payments into the 21st century. The last installment was settled in 2010. But here's the part that matters for today. Germany had two choices. It could slash spending, raise taxes, suffer years of brutal austerity, and slowly pay its debts. Or it could do something much easier in the short term, print money. The German government chose the second option, and at first, it seemed to work. The economy kept moving. People stayed employed. Bills got paid. Politicians stayed in power. The pain was invisible. For a while, the German mark had already been weakened by wartime spending. In 1914, it took about 4.2 marks to buy $1. By 1919, it was 8 marks to the dollar. By 1921, as reparation demands intensified, it was 75 marks to the dollar. The government kept printing. By the summer of 1922, it was 400 marks. Then something broke. Confidence collapsed. Once people started to believe the mark would be worth less tomorrow than today, they stopped saving it and started spending it immediately. Velocity of money exploded. And that feedback loop, printing leading to inflation, leading to more printing to cover the costs of inflation, became impossible to stop. By January 1923, the exchange rate hit 18,000 marks to the dollar. In July 1923, it was 160,000. By August, 1 million. By November of that same year, 11 months, it reached 4.2 trillion marks to the dollar. Prices doubled every few days. Workers were paid twice a day so they could spend their wages before they lost half their value. People burned banknotes for heat because it was cheaper than buying wood. A wheelbarrow full of cash couldn't buy a loaf of bread. This is what's known as hyperinflation, and it didn't just destroy the economy, it destroyed society. The middle class, people who had saved their entire lives, bought government bonds, trusted the system, were wiped out completely. Their savings became worthless paper. Pensioners who had worked 40 years suddenly couldn't afford food. Small businesses collapsed. And into that vacuum of despair and broken trust, political extremism found fertile ground. The hyperinflation of 1923 is one of the key conditions historians point to when explaining how a country with one of the most educated, cultured populations in the world eventually handed power to the Nazi Party a decade later. Economic desperation doesn't just hurt wallets. It destroys the social fabric that holds democracies together. Now here is where you need to pay very close attention, because the story of Weimar is usually told as a cautionary tale about war, defeat, and reparations, a historical anomaly, a one-time catastrophe, something that couldn't possibly apply to today's sophisticated, interconnected, highly regulated global financial system. And that is exactly the kind of thinking that makes the parallel so dangerous. The mechanism that destroyed the Weimar Republic was not war. War was just the trigger. The mechanism was debt that could not be serviced, combined with a government that chose monetary expansion over fiscal discipline, combined with a population that eventually lost faith in the currency. That mechanism is not historical. That mechanism is structural. And right now, in 2026, every single component of it is present in the global economy. Let's start with the debt. Global debt reached $348 trillion at the end of 2025. That is 308% of global GDP, meaning the entire planet owes 3 times more than it produces in a year. Government debt alone stands at $106.70 trillion, up from $96.30 trillion just 1 year earlier, a $10 trillion increase in 12 months. Sovereign bond issuance in OECD countries is projected to hit a record $18 trillion in 2026. Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, one of the most powerful financial institutions on earth, said publicly this year that there will be, his words, some kind of bond crisis. He said we will have to deal with it. He just doesn't know when. But it's not just the size of the debt, it's the structure. In Weimar Germany, the problem wasn't simply that Germany owed money. It was that Germany owed money it could never realistically repay at terms that left no room for growth, at a time when the economy was already fragile. Today, governments around the world have responded to rising interest rates by doing something that should alarm everyone. They are shortening the maturity of their debt. Instead of issuing 30-year bonds, they're issuing 5-year bonds. Instead of locking in long-term rates, they're rolling over debt constantly at whatever the current interest rate happens to be. The share of sovereign issuance with a maturity of over 10 years hit its lowest point since 2009 in 2025. This means governments are not solving the debt problem. They're deferring it, in shorter and shorter intervals, hoping conditions improve before the bill comes due. Refinancing requirements hit $13.50 trillion in 2025 alone, meaning governments had to borrow nearly $14 trillion just to pay back existing debt, not to build roads or hospitals or armies, just to roll over what they already owed. In Weimar Germany, the government printed money partly because it had no other politically acceptable way to meet its obligations. In 2026, governments are not printing money in the dramatic wheelbarrow sense, but they are doing something functionally similar. They are borrowing to pay their borrowing costs. They are issuing new debt to retire old debt. They are depending on central banks that for years were the largest buyers of government bonds, what economists call quantitative easing, to keep interest rates artificially low enough that the debt remains serviceable. And now those central banks are pulling back. The OECD noted explicitly this year that central banks, which were the largest domestic holders of government debt in many countries, have been reducing their bond holdings. That means the market is now increasingly dependent on price-sensitive investors, hedge funds, households, foreign buyers, to absorb record levels of government debt. People who will sell the moment they get nervous. This is where the Weimar parallel becomes uncomfortably precise, because the hyperinflation of 1923 was not purely a money-printing story. It was a confidence story. The mark didn't collapse simply because there was more of it. It collapsed because people stopped believing it would hold value. Confidence is not a soft, abstract concept in economics. It is the only thing standing between a functioning currency and a worthless one. Every fiat currency, every currency not backed by gold or a physical commodity, is worth exactly what the people using it believe it is worth, nothing more. And confidence, once it fractures, does not fracture slowly. It collapses suddenly, non-linearly, in ways that no model predicts and no government controls. We are not in a hyperinflation scenario today. Let's be precise about that. But we are watching the slow erosion of the conditions that protect against one. We are watching central banks that spent decades building credibility as inflation fighters face pressure to keep rates low to prevent governments from defaulting on their debts. We are watching the US dollar, the world's reserve currency, the anchor of the entire global financial system, face its most serious challenge since Bretton Woods. Countries representing a significant portion of global GDP are actively building alternatives to dollar-denominated trade, not because they hate America, because they are watching a country with $36 trillion in national debt and a political system that cannot agree on a budget treat the global reserve currency like a domestic political tool. And they are quietly, methodically reducing their exposure. In 1921, Germany was the country with unsustainable debt and a currency under pressure. The rest of the world could watch from a distance. Today, the debt is global. The currency under pressure is the reserve currency of the entire planetary financial system. There is no outside. There is no country watching safely from a distance. This time, if the confidence breaks, it breaks everywhere simultaneously. There is one more parallel that nobody wants to talk about. In Weimar Germany, the people who suffered most were not the rich. The wealthy had assets, property, foreign currency, gold, businesses. Inflation actually helped some of them because it erased the real value of their debts while their physical assets held value. The people destroyed by hyperinflation were the middle class and the poor, the people who kept their savings in bank accounts, the people who had bought government bonds because they were told it was the safe, responsible thing to do, the people who trusted institutions. Today, the most exposed group to a debt crisis and inflationary spiral is exactly the same. Ordinary people with savings in cash and government bonds. People whose wages cannot keep up with prices. People in emerging markets where the debt-to-GDP ratio is already above 235% and climbing, where currencies are already weakening, where over half of outstanding bonds mature within 3 years, creating a refinancing cliff that could trigger cascading defaults. The OECD's own report this year noted that low-income countries face an exceptionally heavy refinancing schedule, with 29% of their outstanding bonds maturing by the end of 2026. If interest rates stay high and investor confidence wavers, those countries cannot refinance. And when governments can't refinance, they have historically had two choices: default or print. Weimar chose to print. Many will again. None of this is inevitable. That's important to say. The Weimar collapse was not inevitable either. It was the product of specific choices made by specific people under specific pressures. Germany could have accepted a harder path earlier. It chose not to. The global economy today is not locked into a predetermined catastrophe. There are paths forward that involve genuine fiscal discipline, coordinated international debt restructuring, and monetary policy that prioritizes long-term stability over short-term political comfort. The OECD is calling for exactly that. The IMF is calling for exactly that. Jamie Dimon is calling for exactly that. The question is whether governments will make those choices before markets force them to, or whether, like Weimar, they will keep printing, keep borrowing, keep deferring, until the moment when confidence tips, the debt becomes unrollable, and the options narrow to ones no one wants to choose. The Weimar Republic didn't fall because Germans were irresponsible or stupid. It fell because the people in charge faced impossible pressures and chose the path of least resistance at every decision point. Print a little more, borrow a little more, defer the pain a little longer. And then one day the world stopped believing the mark was worth anything, and it wasn't. The transition from functional currency to worthless paper took less than 12 months once it started. That is how fast these things move once confidence breaks. Not years, months, weeks. Right now, markets are calm. The OECD said it themselves. Debt markets show surface-level calm. But they also said that calm masks deeper structural developments, that structural shifts are creating new risks, that the future resilience of debt markets is not guaranteed. Surface-level calm is exactly what the German financial press was writing in 1921. Calm on the surface, a fire underneath that nobody wanted to admit was burning. The question you need to sit with is not whether you believe this will happen. The question is whether you've looked at $348 trillion in global debt, at governments borrowing to pay their borrowing costs, at central banks stepping back from the bond market, at record refinancing requirements, at the slow erosion of dollar dominance, and asked yourself honestly, what are they going to do when they run out of road? What does a government do when it can no longer borrow at affordable rates, when growth is too slow to inflate away the debt organically, when austerity is politically impossible, and when the voters are already angry? History has answered that question before. The answer was Weimar, and the world said never again. But the world also forgot the mechanism. It only remembered the wheelbarrows. That's it for this episode of GNX Daily. If this video made you think differently about what's happening in the global economy, share it with one person who needs to see it. The patterns are always there. Most people just aren't looking.